There's a ridge above Dry Fork that no honest man rode up to, not in 20 years. We had names for it, all of them careful. The High Place, the Old Shelter, the Wrong Side of the Water. Mothers used it to frighten children into their beds, and grown men used it to explain away every bad season they'd ever had: the well that soured, the calf born wrong, the fever that took the prute boy in the spring. Whatever hurt you couldn't name, you laid it up there on that ridge, and then you kept your eyes down when you rode past. I believed all of it. That's the part I never say out loud. I was 51 years old. I'd scouted for the army in my younger and stupider days. I'd seen more than most men see in 3 lifetimes. And I still crossed to the far side of the creek so I wouldn't have to look at that ridge straight on. Then a boy who wasn't afraid of anything, because he was too young to know what fear was worth, put his heels to a borrowed horse and rode straight up the trail everyone told him to leave alone. I want to tell you he was a hero. I want to tell you it turned out the way those stories are supposed to turn out. But I kept a book back then, a little tally book, stub of pencil pushed through the spine, and I wrote down what happened as it happened day by day, because I didn't trust my own memory to keep it honest. And the honest version doesn't have a clean shape to it. The honest version is this: everyone told the cowboy to stay away. He didn't listen. And by the time I understood why, it was already too late to stop what his listening had started. Let me tell you about Wade Coleman. Let me tell you what was really up there. And let me tell you what it cost, because somebody ought to, and there's nobody left who will. That's the thing I want you to understand before anything else. I didn't think brave. I didn't think stubborn. I sat my mare on the low flat by the creek, with the wind coming down off the high country the way it does in the last of October, cold enough to make your back teeth ache, and I watched a young fool point his horse up a trail no sane man used, and my very first thought was, that boy's turned around. He doesn't know where he is. I want that on the record because it tells you something true about me. I'd rather believe a man was ignorant than believe he'd chosen to do the hard thing on purpose. Ignorance you can forgive. Choice you have to reckon with. My name is Eli Marsh. I rode fence for the Caldwell outfit that autumn, which is the sort of work they give a man when he's too old to be worth much and too proud to be told so to his face. It suited me. A fence line doesn't argue. It doesn't ask you where you've been or what you did there. You ride out at first light, you find the breaks where the wires sagged or a post rotted through, you mend what you can and mark what you can't, and you come home when the light goes. Just you and the horse and the long brown miles. My mare was called Biscuit, a bad name for a good animal, hung on her by a child before I ever owned her, and I never had the heart to change it. I talked to her more than I talked to any person in Dry Fork. I've heard men say talking to a horse is the first sign you've gone soft in the head. Maybe so, but Biscuit never once asked me about the war, and there wasn't a soul in that valley I could say the same of. I had a habit in those years, a small one. I kept a tally book in my breast pocket, the kind the drovers used for counting head, and I wrote things in it. Not thoughts, I wasn't a man for thoughts, or told myself I wasn't, just facts. Wire down at the north cut, coyote sign by the wash, frost on the shadow side. Little true things set down in a hand that got worse every year. I think, looking back, that I did it because I'd spent a season of my life once being made to lie, to write reports that said one thing when I'd seen another, and setting down small true facts was the closest I could come to washing my hands. You do what penance you can find. So when Wade Coleman rode up the ridge trail that October afternoon, I took out my book and I wrote it down. Cowboy went up the high place, alone, late day. And then I sat there, and I waited to see if he'd come back down. He did. Just at dusk, with the light gone the color of a bruise, he came back down the trail slow, letting the horse pick its own footing, and he passed within 100 yards of me and never saw me at all. I got a good look at his face. He wasn't lost. That was the second thing I understood that day, and it sat wrong in me the whole ride home. A lost man's face is all questions. This boy's face had an answer in it. He'd gone up there looking for something, and he'd found it. I didn't sleep much that night. You have to understand what the ridge meant, or none of the rest makes sense. 20-odd years before, the shelter up there had belonged to people. Apache, the band that had wintered in that country since before any white man put a name to it. I won't pretend I know the whole of their story, because I don't, and the men who could have told it are all dead or scattered. But I know how it ended, because I was close enough to the ending to have the smell of it still in my clothes. They were moved. That's the word the papers used. Removed. Relocated. Clean words, laundry clean for a thing that wasn't clean at all. Soldiers came, and there was a season of it, a bad season, the kind nobody in Dry Fork will discuss even now, when the discussing can't hurt anybody. And at the end the ridge was empty and the valley was ours, and everyone agreed it was better this way, and nobody looked up at the high place if they could help it. Because here's the thing about a wrong that big. You can win it, you can profit off it. You can build your town on the flat below it and raise your children in the good bottomland and never go hungry a day. But you cannot make it sit easy. It gets into the water somehow. It gets into the way people talk. And after enough years, when nobody wants to say the true reason they can't look at that ridge, they invent a false one. They say it's cursed. They say bad luck lives up there. They lay every ordinary sorrow at its feet, the soured well, the wrong-born calf, the fever, because a curse is a thing you can be afraid of without being ashamed. And shame is the one thing a whole town cannot survive looking at together. I knew all this. I knew it better than most, God help me, because I'd been one of the scouts who rode ahead of the soldiers in that bad season, reading the country for them, telling them where the people were. I never fired on anybody. I've told myself that 10,000 times, lying awake. I never fired. As if a man who holds the door open for a killing gets to keep his hands clean by not swinging the axe himself. I was young. I was hungry. I did what I was paid to do, and I did it well, and it is the single worst thing about me. And I have never told another living person until I'm telling you now. So when the boy went up the ridge and came down with an answer in his face, part of me knew the old buried part, the part that flinched every time I crossed the creek. I knew before I knew. I knew the shelter wasn't empty. I just didn't want to be the one to say it. His name got around before I ever spoke to him. Small towns are like that. Wade Coleman, 22, hired on at the Prout place that summer after drifting up from the territory. Orphaned young, nobody knew the particulars, and he didn't offer them. Quiet. Worked hard. Kept to himself in the bunkhouse, which the other hands took as pride until they figured out it was just that he had nothing he wanted to say. The kind of young man who's easy to overlook, right up, until the moment he does something that nobody can overlook at all. I finally caught up to him at the water trough behind the mercantile, a week after I'd first seen him ride up the ridge. He was watering his horse, and I walked biscuit up beside him casual as I could manage, and I said something about the weather, and he answered polite and short, and I stood there working up to it like a coward. "Saw you ride up the high place," I said finally. His hands went still on the reins, just for a second. Then he went on loosening the girth like I hadn't said anything at all. "That's so. Folks don't go up there." "So I hear." He glanced at me then, sidelong, measuring. He had gray eyes, pale as creek ice, and something in them that was older than the rest of his face. "You gonna tell me why?" And there it was. The question I'd been avoiding my whole adult life, put to me plain by a boy at a water trough. Why? I could have told him. I could have said, because there's an old woman up there, isn't there, and we all know it, and knowing it means knowing what we did, and we would rather she were a curse than a person. I could have said any of that. I said bad luck, that's all, bad luck lives up there. He looked at me a long moment, and then he did something I've never forgotten. He smiled, not mean, not mocking, just tired, the smile of a man who's heard a thing so many times the words have worn smooth. "Mister," he said, "I've been dodging bad luck my whole life. It always finds me anyhow." He pulled the saddle off his horse and swung it up onto the rail. "Figure I might as well go looking for it on my own terms for once." Then he touched his hat and led his horse away. and I stood there by the trough feeling about as small as I have ever felt in my life. I wrote it in the book that night best I could remember it. His words. I've still got them. I read them sometimes when I want to remember that once, at least, I was in the presence of something better than myself and knew it. What was up there was a woman named Nahia. I didn't learn her name until much later, and I'll get to how. But I can tell you now, because you ought to hold her as a person and not a mystery while I tell the rest. She was old, how old, nobody could have said, maybe 70, maybe more. The years had worked her down to bone and sinew, and a pair of hands that never stopped moving. She was near blind, cataracts gone milk-white over both eyes, so that she saw the world as light and shadow and shape, and knew people by their step and their smell and the particular way they breathed. And she was the last of her band left in that country. All the rest moved, killed, scattered south, and her, too frail to travel when they went, hidden by her own people in the one place the soldiers wouldn't search because the soldiers were done searching and thought the ridge was empty. She had lived up there alone for 20 years. I want you to sit with that. 20 years on a wind-scoured ridge, near blind, eating what the land gave and what she could trap and what I later understood. A few frightened souls in the valley had left for her over the years and never once admitted to leaving. 20 years of watching a town grow up in the bottomland below her. A town built on the ground her people were driven off of and never once coming down. Not from fear, I don't think. From something harder than fear. From a kind of stubbornness so deep it had turned into its own reason for living. She was the curse. That plume of smoke from her little fire, seen on winter mornings and blamed on spirits. The occasional shape moving on the ridgeline at dusk, blamed on ghosts. Every ordinary sorrow in Dry Fork had been laid at the feet of one old woman keeping herself alive out of pure refusal, and not one of us had the courage to climb up and find out the truth. Except a boy who'd been dodging bad luck his whole life. He climbed up, and he found her, and instead of running back down with a story to tell, he did the thing that changed everything. He started bringing her food. I know how it went because I watched it happen from a distance over the back half of that autumn. I'd finish my fence line and I'd sit biscuit on the flat and I'd watch the ridge, and near every day there'd come a point where a rider went up. Not fast, not sneaking, just steady up the trail everyone else avoided with a sack behind his saddle. Flour, I later learned, coffee, dried beef, once a length of wool cloth, a tin of the good matches from the mercantile, the kind that struck on anything. He was spending his wages on her. A boy who had nothing, spending it on an old woman he owed nothing to, who couldn't even see his face to thank him. And the town started to notice. That's the part that turns my stomach even now. It wasn't the food they minded. It was the looking. As long as the ridge stayed a curse, we could all keep our story straight. But a boy riding up there every day with a sack of flour, a boy treating the high place like a place where a person lived, that put a crack in the story. And a town will do almost anything to keep its story from cracking. Because behind that story was the true thing, and the true thing was, we knew. Some part of every grown soul in Dry Fork knew there was an old woman up there we'd left to die alone on the bones of her own country. And Wade Coleman, riding up with a sack of flour, was holding a lamp up to all of it. The talk started slow. Cole Boy's gone strange. Cole Boy's got a woman up on the ridge, an Indian woman, said with a curl of the lip, as if the shame of it were his, as if he were the one who'd done something to be ashamed of. I heard it in the mercantile and at the water trough and outside the church on Sundays, and every time I heard it I said nothing, and every time I said nothing I hated myself a little more. Old Prout, Wade's own boss, the man who paid his wages, braced him about it in the yard one evening in front of the other hands, loud enough that half the valley heard the shape of it if not the words. I wasn't there, but I heard about it from 3 different men. And the parts they agreed on were these. Prout told him to leave off, told him folks were talking, told him no good would come of it and that he was making trouble for the whole outfit. And Wade, quiet Wade, keep to himself Wade, the boy who had nothing he wanted to say, looked his boss in the eye and said, She's near 90 and she's blind and she's alone and none of you'll even say her name. I'll say it. She's got a name. And Prout fired him on the spot. Just like that. A good hand in the slack of the year when work was scarce and winter coming, thrown off the place for the crime of feeding an old woman. And Wade Coleman didn't argue and didn't beg. He rolled his blanket and saddled his horse and rode out that same night, not down the valley toward the next town and the next job, the way a sensible man would. Up the ridge. I wrote it in the book by lamplight, my hands shaking, and I don't fully know to this day whether it was shaking from the cold or from shame. Cowboy fired, went up the high place to stay. God forgive us. God forgive me. It came to a head fast after that, the way these things do once the story's cracked, and the town can feel it crumbling. There was a man in Dry Fork named Harlan Voss. Big man, loud, ran the freighting business and half the town's opinion along with it. His father had been a soldier in that bad season 20 years back, one of the ones who did the thing nobody discusses, and I've come to believe in the years since that Harlan hated the ridge worse than any of us precisely because his own blood was tangled up in the reason for it. A man will burn a thing down to keep from looking at it. Harlan Voss wanted that ridge to be a curse so badly that a real live old woman up there, being fed by a fired ranch hand, was a personal affront to him. It made a liar out of his whole life. He got the men together. I heard about it the morning after, heard it the way you hear about a storm that's already broken over the next county and is coming your way. A half dozen of them, maybe more, riled up on Voss's whiskey and Voss's grievance, had decided to go up the ridge and put an end to it. Drive out whatever was up there. Burn the shelter. Make the high place empty again so the story could go back to being clean. They meant to go at dusk, so no one would see them clear. I heard it at the water trough, from a man who told it low and quick and wouldn't meet my eye, the way you pass along a thing you know is wrong but haven't got the spine to stop. And I stood there with my hand on Biscuit's neck, and I felt the whole weight of my life come down on me at once. 51 years. A war I'd scouted for and never spoken of. A door I'd held open for a killing and told myself I never swung the axe. And now, 20 years on, the same axe was being raised again on the same ridge. And this time there was a boy standing in front of it who'd chosen to be there, and an old woman behind him who'd done nothing her whole long life but refused to die. And me at the bottom of the hill, with a tally book full of small true facts, deciding whether I had one more true thing in me. The sun was already sliding down toward the western ridgeline. Dusk was coming, and up on the high place, a boy who'd been dodging bad luck his whole life was about to have it find him at last. 6 men, and a barrel of whiskey, and 20 years of a whole town's shame, all riding up the trail he'd chosen not to run from. I got up on Biscuit. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That's the strange thing. For the first time in 20 years they were still. I turned her toward the ridge. I have ridden Biscuit hard maybe 4 times in all the years I owned her. That evening was the last of them, and the worst, and she gave me everything she had without being asked twice, the way a good horse will when it feels the thing in you that's past reasoning. The trail up the high place was worse than it looked from below. Loose shale, a drop on the west side that the dusk hid until you were right on the lip of it, switchbacks tight enough that Biscuit had to gather and turn near on the spot. I hadn't been up there in 20 years, not since the bad season. And I'll tell you, climbing it in the failing light, I felt every one of those years peel back, until I was young and hungry and reading the country for men who meant murder, and the shame of it was so thick in my throat I near turned around. But I didn't. And I want to be careful here not to make myself sound braver than I was. I didn't climb that ridge because I was good. I climbed it because I could not stand one more day of being the man at the bottom of the hill. That's a poorer reason than heroism. It's the only one I had. I crested the ridge just as the last light went orange and low. And there it was, the shelter, smaller than the stories made it. A low brush and hide dwelling banked against a shoulder of rock, a ring of stones for a fire, A few clay vessels, a rack of drying herbs, everything worn and mended and kept. The small, careful kingdom of a person who had lived a long time on almost nothing. 20 years of a life, laid out in the dusk. And it broke something in me to see it, because it was so plainly the home of a person, not a curse, not a ghost, not a story we told to keep from looking. A person. An old woman had made a home up here, in sight of the town that pretended she was weather. Wade was standing in front of it, and Voss's men were already there. I'd beaten them by not much, and it didn't matter because there were 6 of them and 1 of him. They'd come up on foot the last stretch, horses picketed below, and they stood in a loose half-circle in the firelight with the particular ugly ease of men who have drunk enough to feel righteous. Voss out front, a can of coal oil in one man's hand, and Wade Coleman, 22 years old, unarmed, standing between them and the low dark doorway of the shelter with his boot heels dug in and his chin up. "Move, boy," Voss was saying. "This ain't your fight, never was. Move and go on down the hill and we'll forget you had any part in it." No. Just that, no speech, no argument. Wade Coleman had never been a boy for words, and he wasn't going to start now. He just stood there in the firelight and said no, and put his body between 6 men and an old blind woman and meant it. "There's a person in there," he said when Voss started forward. "Old woman, can't see, can't run. You want to burn her out, you'll do it through me." And Voss stopped, just for a second, because that's the thing about the story a town tells itself. It only works as long as nobody says the true thing out loud, and Wade had just said it. There's a person in there. You could see it land on some of those men. You could see a couple of them shift, look at their boots, remember they were fathers and sons and not just Voss's fists. The coal oil hung there in the one man's hand, unlit. But Voss couldn't stop. I understood it even then. His whole life was built on that ridge being empty. If there was a person up here, then his father had been a certain kind of man, and Harlan was that man's son, and everything he'd told himself came down. He'd rather burn it than know it. So he did the thing men like him always do when the truth gets close. He reached for his gun. That's when I stepped into the firelight. "Harlan." My voice came out steadier than I had any right to. 6 men turned. Voss's hand froze on his pistol. "Marsh," Voss squinted at me, "you get up here to help or to watch." And here is the moment. The one I'd been riding toward my whole life without knowing it. I could have played it safe even then. I could have talked around it. "Now, boys, let's not do something we'll regret, the coward's peacemaking that changes nothing." I'd done that my whole life. Talked around the true thing. I didn't do it this time. "I scouted for the soldiers," I said, loud enough that all of them heard it. "In the bad season, 20 years back. I rode ahead and I read the country and I told them where the people were up here all through this country, and I have never once said it out loud to a living soul until right now." My voice cracked and I let it. "Whatever's up here that you're all so scared of, that shame, it's mine as much as anybody's. More. And I am done. I am done pretending she's a curse so I don't have to look at what I did. She's a person. Her name is—" And that's when a voice came out of the dark doorway of the shelter. Old. Cracked. Speaking words I half knew from 20 years back, and then, slow, in English worn down to the bone from 20 years of no one to speak it to. "Nahio." She came out into the firelight. Bent, tiny, wide-eyed, one hand on the doorframe and the other on Wade's shoulder where he stood in front of her. She couldn't see any of us. She could only hear 6 men and their whiskey and their coal oil, and she came out anyway because she'd figured, I think, that if the boy was going to die in front of her door, she wasn't going to let him do it alone. "My name," she said to the dark full of men she couldn't see, "is Nahia. I have been here all this time. I know you have been afraid of me. And then, and I will hear this until I die," she almost smiled, "I was afraid of you also." Nobody moved. The fire snapped. The coal oil hung there unlit in a man's slack hand. And into that silence, Nahia lifted her old face toward the sound of my voice, toward the man who just confessed to leading the soldiers to her people 20 years gone, and she said something that I have spent every year since trying to be worthy of. "I know your voice," she said. "You were young, you were afraid too." A pause. "I have had a long time up here to decide what to do with the ones who are still afraid." Her clouded eyes found me, or seemed to. "I decided to feed the boy who came, that is all, that is the whole of it. They didn't burn the shelter. I'd like to tell you it was my confession that stopped them, or Wade's courage, or some grand turning of hearts. It wasn't quite. It was smaller and truer than that. It was an old woman coming out of the dark and saying her own name and being, after 20 years of being a curse, suddenly, undeniably, only a person. You cannot burn a person as easily as you can burn a curse. Some of those men had it in them anyway. Most didn't. Voss stood there with his hand on his gun and his whole life coming down around him. And in the end he was one man, and the others wouldn't back him. And a thing that needs 6 men can't be done by one. He turned and went down the hill in the dark, and the others went after him, and the coal oil got carried back down unlit. And that was that. It should be the happy ending. Boy stands his ground, town's shame gets spoken, old woman saved. Cut it there and it's a fine story. But I kept a book, and the book has to be honest. Nahia died that winter. Not from Voss, not from any man's hand. She died the way the very old die, in her own shelter in her sleep on the ground she'd refused to leave for 20 years, and Wade was with her. Because after that night he never did go back down the hill. He stayed. He wintered up there with her, chopped her wood and hauled her water, and near as I could tell, just kept her company those last months, so that the last of her long life was not spent alone. I rode up when I could. I brought what I could carry. She'd tell me things sometimes in the worn-down English, about the country before the town, about her people, about her grandmother who'd shown her the herbs on the rack. Never once about the bad season. Never once did she throw my shame in my face. She'd just take my hand in both of her old ones and hold it a while, and that was harder to bear than any accusation, and better. She's buried up on the ridge. Wade dug the grave himself in ground half frozen, and it took him 3 days, and he wouldn't let me help. I understood. Some things a man has to do with his own hands or they don't count. He didn't stay after that. Once she was in the ground there was nothing to keep him, and Dry Fork had never been his home, and I don't think he could stand to look at the town below anymore. He rode out one gray morning in the first thaw, stopped at the bottom of the ridge trail where I sat Biscuit, waiting because I'd known he'd go. I asked him where. He said he didn't know. He said he'd figure it out on the way he always had. Then he looked back up the ridge one time at the little shelter and the fresh grave beside it, and something moved in his face that I don't have the words for, and he touched his hat to me the way he had that first day at the trough. "You know the strange thing," he said. "Everybody told me to stay away from up there. My whole life somebody's telling me to stay away from something." That tired smile. "I never once did what I was told, got me nothing but trouble." He shook his head and his voice went rough. "But this time it got me her, so." He didn't finish it. He just nodded like he'd said all of it and turned his horse down the valley, and I watched him ride out until the land took him. I still ride up the ridge sometimes. An old man now, older than Nahia seemed to me then. I sit by the little grave and I take out the tally book, same one, held together with string these days, and I read the small true things I set down that autumn. The wire down at the north cut, the frost on the shadow side. Cowboy went up the high place, alone. And I think about how a whole town built a curse out of its own shame, and how one boy who never once did as he was told rode up and found, instead of a curse, an old woman who was only ever a person, and how the only thing it took to end 20 years of a lie was for somebody to be brave enough to say her name out loud. I say it out loud now, every time I come up, to the wind, to the grave, to nobody. Nahia. I don't know if it's forgiveness. I don't think it works that way. But it's the truest thing I've got, and I set it down here so that